Well, joining me now from Medford, Massachusetts is Professor of Korean Studies, Sung-Yoon Lee. Monica, California is Bruce Bennett. He's a senior defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. And in Washington, D.C., policy analyst Olivia Enos, who works in the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Good to have you all on the Newsmakers. Sung-Yoon Lee, let me start with you, sir. We have had reunification be a buzzword over the past few weeks as we talk about North and South Korea. Is it something that's ever likely to happen in the immediate future, or is it still something that's questionable as to whether it might happen in any of our lifetimes?
Korean reunification is, of course, something that's possible. It lies within the realm of the possible. The decline and fall of civilizations, nation-states, both big and small, it's a recurring theme in history. At the same time, it's also entirely possible that the two Korean states will, for the foreseeable future, or even for the next century, or in perpetuity, remain divided. But within the Korean historical experience, there's a strong sense of a shared past and perhaps even a common future. Hence, as an abstraction, as an ideal, the propensity to say that we support Korean unification, it's the right thing to do, that slogan, that idea is very strong in both North Korea and South Korea. But when you ask a South Korean on a practical level, what are you willing to do to defray, to support the economic cost of unification? The answer invariably is not much. I'm not that interested.
Right. And Bruce, a lot of people say, well, it's not feasible for South Korea, even if it does happen. People look at the example of East and West Germany only on steroids, I guess, and they feel that, well, South Korea will just have all these refugees, its economy won't be able to deal with it. It's not quite feasible, so it's a nice thing to talk about, but it's not really within the realms of possibility. Is that a fair assessment, Bruce?
Well, I think you have to divide the logical concept from the emotion, the feeling. Logically, you're right. It's very difficult to think about how unification would occur. But emotionally, as Professor Lee said, this is something that people feel strongly about in many ways. And so it's really hard to tell what we have in the future. It could happen in ways that we don't expect. There are many different ways that unification could occur.
Olivia, we've had North Korea recently say that it wants reunification under two separate governments or two separate regimes in the North and South, which seems to be a slight change from the past, because in the past they used to say we want reunification on our terms only. Is that a positive sign?
I mean, I think that all Koreans, as Sung-Yoon Lee referenced, really do feel connected by bloodline. They see reunification as a possibility, and to some extent, there is a division between, I think, the older generation of Koreans and versus the younger generation of Koreans who fear about the economic consequences, et cetera. I think that it is a good idea to have reunification as an eventual possibility, but the reality that anyone in South Korea would ever submit under Kim Jong-un's authority is out of question, particularly considering the severe human rights violations and the threat that Kim Jong-un himself poses to the international community. So I think it's unlikely and unwise to be considering an eventuality where you would have two separate political systems, but a unified Korea. I think you need to be looking more toward a democratic future for a unified Korea, and a peaceful one at that.
Okay, Sung-Yoon Lee. Is it ever possible to have a unified Korea with two systems, one run by, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, Juche communism, Kim Il-sungism, and the other one being South Korea, a messy democracy?
So the income gap between the North and the South, some say is 30 times. That is, South Korea is 30 times richer than the North. Some say 50 times. Probably it's closer to 50 times. And that kind of glaring income disparity you don't see anywhere else in the world. So on a pragmatic level, can you have an equitable merger, union between a very poor, backward country and one of the richest nations in the world? I don't think so. To my mind, there are only two plausible ways of unification. One, the German model, the richer German state absorbing the other German state. Two, the Vietnam model, the poorer Vietnamese state by force after having compelled the U.S. to sign a peace treaty and abandon its client state in the South, just march right in as North Vietnam did in 1975. So when North Korea says, let's do a confederation, what North Korea means is, and they spell it out, they've been doing it, saying so since 1960, let's do a loose confederation, have equal numbers of representatives from the North and South, although the South Korean population remains and has always been twice as large as that in the North. And then we'll have more discussions, maybe hold a nationwide election, of course, in the North. Fully 100% of the North Korean population will support the North Korean candidate. So that's the game plan North Korea has in mind, one day to obliterate the Republic of Korea and complete its communist revolution.
And Professor Lee, on this program and elsewhere, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you felt over the past year and a half or so with all the diplomacy, Kim Jong-un has tried to pull a fast one on people, and he has done quite well in terms of PR, right? So as things stand right now, with his standing and perhaps in the balance of power, he's standing stronger than he's ever been and maybe stronger than his father ever was. What's ever more likely in the immediate future, the German model or the Vietnam model?
Well, North Korea has insisted on a peace treaty with the United States. I mean, peace treaty sounds very pleasant, very placid, very peaceful even. But what does it mean? Well, you can have a peace treaty between antagonistic adversaries that are interested in putting the past behind them, really in peace, or you can have a fake peace treaty which would impel changes in the region. First, the dismantlement of the United Nations Command, and then probably the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the South in the wake of a peace treaty. Americans will be calling for it alongside with North Koreans and South Koreans and perhaps others. So North Korea has a playbook, a clear game plan, and by forging an end-of-war declaration or compelling President Trump to agree to a peace treaty, North Korea would be far better positioned to bully, to exploit, to censor South Korea to a far greater degree than it is now. So Kim Jong-un is sitting really, pretty. He is in the catbird seat, and he will continue to behave in the coming months and be more regarded as a legitimate, reasonable statesman with whom the world can do business.
Olivia, has Trump's diplomacy emboldened and empowered Kim Jong-un?
I think that there's a lot of concern that the meeting in Singapore legitimized Kim Jong-un in a way that he really did not merit at all. I mean, this is an incredibly brutal dictator. This is an individual who imprisons between 80,000 to 120,000 individuals in political prison camps. This is a guy who still wields a rogue nuclear and missile program. And I think that that's a huge concern, not only with the meeting in Singapore, but also with a future perspective meeting, maybe in Vietnam at the end of February. And I think that this is really concerning. The U.S. should not be continuing to grant legitimacy to a leader who acts in such a way that violates the fundamental human rights of its people, as well as threatens the human rights of individuals beyond its borders. And so I think that there is a lot of concern about the diplomacy.
Okay, so Bruce Bennett, what do you do? If there's concern over the diplomacy and that the diplomacy might not be, I don't know, I guess the diplomacy might be strengthening someone who doesn't deserve it, then what do you do?
Well, I think the key that you've got to do is you've got to turn and get Kim Jong-un to meet his commitments that he's already made. In April 27th, he agreed to fully implement all past agreements and declarations. The 1992 denuclearization declaration said that North Korea would have zero nuclear weapons, zero production capacity. He's not doing that. He's doing exactly the opposite. So this coming summit, if it's going to be meaningful, has got to lead at least to something like a production freeze, reducing the threat, but in addition needs to start eliminating some of the North Korean nuclear weapons. If we don't do that, we have a real problem. I would guess, roughly speaking, that in 2018, North Korea increased its nuclear destructive potential by about 70%. That's not peace. That's not conditions for a peace agreement.
Right. And talking about opening up, let's have a listen to North Korean defector and the head of Seoul Pyongyang TV, Lim Yong-sun. Have a little listen, and I've got a question off the back of that.
실행해야 될 게 있어요.
There are things he must do to revive the economy, reform and open up. But reforming and opening up could undermine the weak regime Kim Jong-il established.
Sung-Yoon Lee, pragmatically, does that make sense? Does he know, does Kim Jong-un know that if he opens up too much, that's the end of him, and that's the end of his power, and that's the end of the entire system? So he needs to be open enough to just get foreign currency in and keep afloat, but not too open. Is that where we're at?
Yes, outsiders, visitors to the showcase capital city of North Korea, Pyongyang, come away dazzled that there are actually human beings instead of all robots living in that city. They come away very impressed that there are fancy buildings, department stores, high-rises, Western-style restaurants. But Pyongyang has always been that, a model Potemkin city. The rest of North Korea is miserable. It's really, it's like Korea in the 50s, perhaps, South Korea, that is. So I think we're looking in the wrong places for signs of genuine reform. And the reason that Kim, the regime, is unable to reform in a meaningful way is due to the very unfortunate existence of a far more prosperous, far more legitimate Korean state across the border. No one gives any respect to South Korea, including South Korea itself, but its existence, South Korea as a model, as a magnet to the North Korean people, presents the Kim regime with a long-term existential threat. So when we opine that we want North Korea to follow China's example, Vietnam's example, remaining a single-party communist dictatorship but introducing gradual reform and opening, I think it's much harder in the case of North Korea, because in those cases, the Chinese, Vietnamese cases, there was no superior Chinese state. There was no superior Vietnamese state beckoning your own people.
Right. And Bruce, as we circle back to the prospect of reunification, same people, same ethnicity, same culture, same language. But I guess we could say twins separated at birth, one brought up by narco traffickers, the other by nuns. And I guess you can decide which one is which, right? At some point, have they become so fundamentally different, Bruce, that it's going to be impossible for there ever to be a seamless reunification?
Well, I think they have become very different, language-wise even. We talk about even simple things like science. North Korea, you cannot use foreign terms in science. In South Korea, there's a wide variety of English terms that have come into it. So the language has changed to some extent. This is some difference in culture. So it will be difficult. And from a South Korean perspective, you cannot apply all South Korean laws to North Korea if you get a South Korea-led unification. If you did, you'd have to throw several million people into prison who have done business and had to do bribery or take bribes in North Korea. So culturally, there has to be more thought about how you get to a peaceful unification and making those efforts to set the stage for that today, if that's where you want to go. Otherwise, yes, the division will continue.
Olivia, in all your answers, you mentioned human rights violations. I mean, these are well documented, basically gulags, right? And I also went for one of those stage-managed trips. I ran the Pyongyang Marathon, and they showed me all the nice stuff. They didn't show me anything else, right? It was a fascinating experience. Now, Olivia, you speak about human rights. Has the fact that the nuclear issue has been so central to all of this meant that Kim Jong-un can get away with all the human rights violations? Because ultimately, in realpolitik, all the United States and others care about is that, hey, we don't want you to proliferate nuclear weapons.
Unfortunately, I think there's been a real avoidance since Singapore of the human rights issue. You didn't see it raised during the summit discussions. And then post-Singapore, you really haven't seen it. You've even seen the South Korean government going out of their way to silence the voices of many North Korean refugees. You have seen the mandated funding that's supposed to go towards human rights issues from the North Korean Human Rights Act in South Korea be effectively zeroed out. And then even in the United States, I think there has been less of a willingness to discuss some of the human rights issues. I think this is a shame because I don't think we should be viewing our dialogue with North Korea as human rights versus denuclearization. We really should be viewing it as these two issues working together in tandem. And I think that there are a lot of ways that we can do this. For example, in order to test North Korea's sincerity, we should ask, could we have humanitarian workers and otherwise have access to the neediest individuals inside these political prison camps? Could that be one of the ways that we test whether North Korea is sincere in fulfilling its obligations? As Bruce mentioned earlier in the conversation, North Korea really hasn't taken practical steps since Singapore to demonstrate its sincerity with denuclearization. We need to start seeing steps that do demonstrate sincerity. And I think we need to see a return to that call not only for complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program, but perhaps be even more bold and call for complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's vast political prison camp system.
Yeah. Professor Lee, if the United States asks to visit the gulags and take a look, is it ever likely going to get a yes answer?
No, and the nature of the North Korean regime, yes, it's armed with nuclear weapons and ICBMs, but it's also armed with gulags. Why? Because the oppression of the people, keeping the people desperately clinging on for survival, that is dependent on the state, that is an essential means of control of regime preservation. So North Korea is, we know, a poor nation, often beset, always beset by serious food insecurity. And if you look at various metric surveys of food insecurity, according to the UN, the latest figures from the Food and Agriculture Organization of 2018, food insecurity in the world, places North Korea in a virtual tie with Zimbabwe and Zambia, and number 3 in the world in terms of undernourishment as a percentage of the total population. You go down the list, you don't see any other country besides North Korea that is industrialized, that is literate, that has nukes, that has ICBMs, that spends $700 million a year importing luxury goods like fancy cars and Rolex watches. So it shows you that the regime has perverse priorities. It's not that the regime, the government doesn't have money, but chooses not to spend its wealth on importing food and instead on weapons of mass destruction. So human rights is essential to the nuclear issue. It is not a stumbling block, a roadblock. It is not a nuisance. It really drives home to the core, the nature, the priorities of the North Korean state, and the United States must raise human rights directly vis-a-vis Kim.
Bruce Bennett, very finally, for those who want to plan a visit to the demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel, what's your advice to them right now? It's not likely to go away anytime soon, is it?
No, it's not likely to go away, but it's an important thing to see because what you'll see is how militarized North Korea is and the hard attitude over there. It's a valid thing to see. Look at the tunnels under the demilitarized zone that North Korea has dug, over 20 tunnels. This is a state that really is anxious to impose its will on the South, and we have to support the South to avoid that.
Okay. Sung-Yoon Lee, Bruce Bennett, and Olivia Enos, great to have you all on the Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us.